Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject that once decided who lived, who died, and who got dramatically drowned in the village pond: witchcraft. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In today's world, owning a cat means you either love animals, have an allergy to commitment, or simply enjoy being judged silently while you eat snacks. But in the Middle Ages, your cat wasn't a quirky companion. It was hard evidence that you were in league with the devil, and it didn't even have to be black. Sure, black cats got the worst PR. They were considered Satan's preferred colour scheme, but any cat was suspect. Cats, you see, were thought to be familiars, magical animal assistants gifted to witches by dark forces. Their main purpose? Spying on you, delivering your spells, and licking the blood of your enemies off their paws. Which, in fairness, sounds like a typical Tuesday for some cats. If you were seen feeding a cat, people might think you were sustaining your demon servant. If you let it curl up in your lap, clearly you were holding a private strategy meeting with your infernal advisor. And if you spoke to your cat, which of course everyone does, your neighbours might not hear, "Who's my little fluffy baby?" but "Go forth, destroy the barley crop, and make Agnes trip over her spinning wheel." The church wasn't much help in clearing the feline's name. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a decree linking cats to devil worship. This sparked waves of cat killings in some towns, an act of religious zealotry that, in one of history's greatest ironies, may have made the Black Death worse. Fewer cats meant more rats meant more fleas meant more plague. And naturally, when the plague hit, guess who got blamed? That's right, witches. It was a self-sustaining paranoia loop. Even if you didn't own a cat, just having one hang around your house could raise eyebrows. Stray cats were basically furry accusations with tails. And if your cat scratched someone, leaving them bleeding, that was seen as a demonic attack. The only defense was convincing people that Mittens wasn't possessed. He was just a jerk, which, to be fair, is hard to argue. In the Middle Ages, knowing your way around a spice rack was fine, as long as your knowledge stopped at "salt makes things salty." Anything more advanced, and you were basically on a first-name basis with Lucifer. Herbs, especially medicinal ones, were deeply suspicious. If you could brew a tea that soothed a cough, you might have studied under a healer. But if it actually worked, you had clearly made a pact with the devil. See, medieval medicine relied on two things: prayer and bloodletting. And if your method didn't involve draining half the patient's fluids while muttering Latin, people assumed you had gotten your knowledge from a less heavenly source. The problem was that many women, especially midwives and older village healers, knew how to use plants for practical remedies. They could make salves for wounds, tinctures for fevers, and poultices for infections. To the average villager, this was impressive. To the local priest, this was suspiciously effective magic. It didn't help that some herbs had dual purposes. Chamomile could soothe an upset stomach, but also help someone sleep. Valerian could calm nerves, but also make people a little too calm if you used enough of it. And heaven forbid you knew about mandrake root, a plant so steeped in myth that digging it up was said to cause screaming that could kill you. Just owning some meant you probably used it to hex people in your spare time. Accusations often started small. You'd give a man a peppermint infusion for his indigestion. Later, he'd be seen feeling better, and instead of thanking you, someone would whisper, "That's not medicine. She's bewitched his insides." Next thing you know, you're on trial for sorcery, your entire garden being presented as Exhibit A. In fact, one of the more damning pieces of evidence in witch trials was the possession of an herb book, even if it was just a badly illustrated guide to which plants weren't edible. To the court, this wasn't education, it was a spell book in disguise. In the modern world, being left-handed just means you have a slightly harder time using scissors and will always smudge your handwriting. In the Middle Ages, it meant you were probably on Satan's payroll. The very word for left in Latin, sinister, eventually gave us the English word for evil. That's how deep the bias ran. Right-handedness was associated with order, goodness, and divine favor. Left-handedness? That was chaos, deception, and black magic. Basically, if God was right-handed, the devil was a southpaw. If you wrote with your left hand, you were writing backward. A suspicious skill that looked unnatural to medieval eyes. And let's be honest, medieval handwriting already looked like a series of arcane runes, so doing it left-handed probably looked like you were channeling dark forces. It didn't help that being left-handed made you stand out. People didn't like different in the Middle Ages. They liked exactly the same as the rest of us, so we can all sleep at night knowing nobody is secretly summoning storms. If you picked up a tool, a cup, or a weapon with your left hand, you might hear someone mutter, "Mark my words, that one's trouble." Church art didn't do you any favours either. In religious paintings, Christ was often shown blessing with his right hand, while devils, sinners, and the damned were depicted using their left. So if you so much as stirred a pot counterclockwise with your left hand, someone in the village might start pre-writing your confession. Even combat wasn't safe territory. If you fought with your left hand, people didn't think, "Oh, they're a skilled and unpredictable warrior." They thought, only a witch would switch the sword to their bad hand and still win. Which is flattering, but also life-threatening. Parents sometimes tried to fix left-handed children by tying their left hand behind their back until they learned to use the good one. And if that didn't work, well, there was always the whispering and side-eye at church. Today, talking to yourself just means you're either working through a problem, practicing a conversation, or realizing too late that people can hear you through your earbuds. In the Middle Ages, it meant you were casting a spell, probably on the person who overheard you. Self-talk in a medieval village wasn't a harmless habit. If you muttered while walking, people assumed you were whispering incantations to unseen spirits. If you did it near someone's house, well, congratulations. You just cursed their entire family and their goats. It didn't help that life back then was really quiet. No traffic noise, no TVs, no podcasts to mask your mumbling. If you whispered to yourself while feeding chickens, someone across the lane could hear every syllable and probably mishear it. "Please lay eggs" became "release the plague." Superstition thrived on coincidence. Say you're walking home, muttering about how you wish the wind would stop rattling your shutters. That night, the wind dies down. The next morning, you wake up to a knock on your door. It's the local priest, here to ask why you're controlling the weather without permission. Even prayer could backfire. Whispering a personal prayer outside of church? Dangerous. Unless it was supervised Latin in front of a priest, your words were assumed to be suspicious. Private devotion looked a lot like private spell work. Talking to animals was even worse. Sure, you might just be telling your cow she's a good girl, but to the average medieval gossip, you were commanding your demonic familiar to do your bidding. And cats? Don't even get me started. You could be discussing dinner plans and someone would insist you were instructing your feline to hex the miller's wife. People didn't need much to confirm their suspicions. If they already thought you were odd, your habit of muttering while sewing, gardening, or brewing ale was all the evidence they required. In some trials, witnesses even testified to hearing strange words, which could have been anything from a made-up tune to your grocery list. In the Middle Ages, your social life was less about personality and more about avoiding the executioner's list. Too many friends? You were obviously bewitching people into liking you. Too few friends? You were obviously cursing anyone who came near you. It was a flawless system, if the goal was to make everyone paranoid. If you were unusually popular, people assumed it wasn't because you were charming, funny, or had the good bread recipe. No, you were enchanting people. Literally. How else could you explain half the village showing up to help you thatch your roof when they wouldn't even help their own cousins? Clearly, you'd been brewing love potions and sprinkling them into the communal ale. On the other hand, if you preferred to keep to yourself, the suspicion meter cranked up just as fast. Living quietly, avoiding gossip, and tending your own business. That was practically a written confession. Solitary people made perfect scapegoats for misfortunes. When the mill broke, the sheep got sick, or the baker's wife tripped over a chicken, someone would say, "Well, you know who never comes to festivals?" Festivals were especially dangerous. If you danced too well, you were tempting men with your wicked moves. If you didn't dance at all, you were silently cursing the dancers. If you left early, you were sneaking home to perform rituals under the moonlight. And if you stayed until the end, you were gathering gossip for your next hex. Even family ties couldn't save you. If your relatives were popular, people might say you were leeching off their good reputation through magic. If your relatives were disliked, well, witchcraft clearly ran in the bloodline. The worst part was, you couldn't really change how you were perceived. Trying to even things out only made you look more suspicious. Go from shy to social? You'd been converted by dark forces. Go from social to quiet? You'd made a new pact and were plotting something big. In the Middle Ages, midwifery was one of the few respected roles a woman could have. Respected, that is, right up until something went wrong. Then it instantly became witchcraft in disguise. A midwife's job was to deliver babies, and given medieval survival rates, this was about as safe and predictable as juggling lit torches while blindfolded. If the baby and mother survived, clearly you'd called on dark powers to grant them life. If the baby didn't survive, clearly you'd sacrificed it to those same dark powers. It was a win-win for the accusers. The paranoia ran deep. Birth was dangerous in the Middle Ages, and no one understood biology well enough to separate bad luck from intentional malice. Complications like breech births, infections, or postpartum bleeding were common, and since someone had to be blamed, the midwife was the easiest target. It didn't help that midwives knew about herbs and remedies to ease pain or speed labour. These were often the same herbs used in other suspicious activities, so a birthing tonic looked a lot like a witch's brew. And heaven forbid you used anything unusual, like chanting, gentle massage, or, worst of all, boiled water. Such extravagance was proof you were doing something unnatural. Midwives also saw a lot of, well, everything. They knew private details about families, including who had been pregnant, who mysteriously wasn't anymore, and which child bore a suspicious resemblance to the blacksmith instead of the husband. This kind of knowledge made people nervous. In a society where gossip travelled faster than disease, "she knows too much" could quickly turn into "she knows too much because she talks to demons." Sometimes, the accusation didn't even start with the family involved. A jealous rival, a spurned suitor, or a cranky neighbour could accuse a midwife of witchcraft simply to ruin her livelihood. All it took was one bad outcome, or one healthy baby whose parents didn't like you, and the whispers began. In the Middle Ages, meteorology wasn't a science, it was a blame game. And if a storm, frost, drought, or oddly shaped cloud happened near your home, the explanation was simple. You did it. It didn't matter that weather patterns were beyond anyone's control. If hail flattened the barley crop, someone had to be responsible. And you, with your slightly odd habits and unfortunate location, fit the bill perfectly. A lightning strike in your yard? Proof that you were summoning fire from the heavens? A late frost just before planting season? Clearly you'd whispered to the moon to ruin the harvest. Rain was particularly suspicious. Too much of it and you'd summoned floods. Too little and you'd bound the clouds. The fact that you benefited just as little from bad weather as everyone else didn't matter. Logic was optional. Some accusations were hilariously specific. In parts of Europe, it was believed witches could milk storm clouds the way farmers milked cows. If a sudden downpour hit after you'd been seen in the fields, people assumed you'd been squeezing rain out of the sky for personal gain. And by personal gain, they meant evil purposes nobody could quite define. Travellers could make things worse. If they passed through and claimed, "The weather was fine until I reached this village. Congratulations, you were now the village's climate control suspect." No one questioned the traveller's honesty, because why would a stranger ever lie? church sermons also fanned the flames. Priests sometimes preached that witches could steer storms to punish sinners or protect their own crops. So if your garden looked better than your neighbour's after a season of bad weather, you might as well start packing for your trial. Your only real defence was luck, and not living near any major weather events. But in a time before accurate forecasting, that was like trying to avoid puddles while walking blindfolded through a rainstorm. Eventually, nature would turn against you, and the villagers would follow. In the Middle Ages, your skin wasn't just skin. It was evidence. A mole, a freckle, a birthmark, or any odd bump could be interpreted as a witch's mark, proof that you'd signed a contract with the devil. Forget written agreements. Medieval demons apparently preferred to initial their deals directly on your body. These so-called witches' marks were thought to be where a witch's familiar, their animal-shaped demon sidekick, would suckle. Yes, really. If you had a mole near your arm or neck, the story went that you were feeding your demonic pet like some sort of infernal cat cafe. Birthmarks, especially unusual ones, were equally dangerous. A strawberry-shaped mark? That was the devil's brand. A dark freckle? A secret portal for evil spirits? An oddly shaped scar? Clearly the result of a midnight ritual gone wrong. And heaven help you if the mark vaguely resembled a symbol. The moment someone said, "It looks like a crescent moon," you might as well start practicing your innocent yet doomed expression. Witch hunters even had a professional method for finding these marks. During interrogations, they'd strip the accused and poke at anything suspicious with a needle. If the spot didn't bleed or hurt, that was proof it was unnatural. Of course, nerves vary on the skin, so sometimes you just didn't feel the poke, and congratulations, you were now guilty. It wasn't just about where the mark was. It was about whether you could explain it. If you said you'd been born with it, people assumed you were born a witch. If you claimed it appeared later in life, clearly it had shown up after your pact with dark forces. Either way, your argument didn't stand much of a chance against mob logic. Some unlucky souls were even accused because of perfectly normal beauty marks. What might get you a modelling contract today would have gotten you a front row seat at your own execution back then. The irony? Those same marks were sometimes considered lucky in other cultures, but medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for embracing alternative viewpoints. In the Middle Ages, medicine was basically a coin toss, except the coin was weighted heavily toward death. Recovery was slow, painful, and often more dangerous than the original illness. So if you healed someone quickly, you clearly weren't following the approved medieval medical procedure. Bleed them, pray over them, and hope they didn't die of an infection from the leeches. The logic went like this. Illness came from God, either as a test or a punishment. Therefore, curing someone too swiftly was interfering with divine will. If you managed to fix a fever overnight, that wasn't a blessing. It was sorcery. This put healers in a bind. If they worked slowly and patients suffered, they were just doing their job. But if they worked too efficiently, they were meddling in unnatural ways. It was the medieval version of no good deed goes unpunished. Herbalists were especially at risk. A tea made from willow bark could bring down a fever in hours. And since no one understood it contained a natural painkiller, basically medieval aspirin, people assumed the only explanation was magic. And not the fun, sparkly kind, the kind that came with pitchforks and torches. Even pure coincidence could doom you. Let's say the baker's wife has been bedridden for a week, and you bring her some soup. She drinks it, feels better, and gets up the next morning. Instead of thanking you, she and half the village are now debating whether you used a resurrection spell. Congratulations, your chicken broth is now legally a curse, and heaven forbid you healed someone the local priest didn't like. If the patient was unpopular, their recovery might be seen as proof you were helping the wrong sort of people. Suddenly, you weren't just a witch. You were in league with the village troublemakers too. To make matters worse, some healers did keep their recipes secret, not because they were magical, but because they didn't want others stealing their trade. Unfortunately, secrecy was all the proof anyone needed to accuse you of occult knowledge. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy wasn't exactly generous. But that didn't mean you could get away with your husband dying too soon. If you found yourself widowed at a young age, the villagers weren't going to say, "What a tragedy." They were going to say, convenient. Marriage back then was a practical arrangement. A husband's death often meant property changing hands, debts vanishing, and, most suspicious of all, a woman suddenly having more independence than was considered safe. In a society terrified of women making their own decisions, being a young widow was practically an engraved invitation for witchcraft accusations. If your husband had been ill for months, it was suspicious. You'd let the sickness linger so you could inherit his land. If he died suddenly, that was even worse. Clearly you'd poisoned his ale or whispered him into the grave with some bedtime hex. And of course, the condition of your late husband's soul was also up for debate. If he died peacefully, you'd lulled him into the afterlife with your dark charms. If he died screaming, well, you were obviously dragging him to hell personally. No matter the details, you were at fault. Even your behavior after the funeral could make things worse. If you grieved too little, you were cold-hearted and probably thrilled to be rid of him. If you grieved too much, you were overcompensating to hide your guilt. If you moved on quickly, you'd clearly planned the whole thing. And if you didn't remarry, you were probably living off the devil's pension. Some widows were accused simply because they had the audacity to survive their husbands. In an age when men were seen as protectors, a woman doing just fine on her own meant she must have unnatural help. Spoiler: unnatural help was code for witchcraft. Of course, widowed men didn't face this same scrutiny. If a man remarried 3 weeks after his wife's funeral, people said, well, he needs someone to cook for him. If a woman remarried quickly, she was labelled a black widow, sometimes literally. In the Middle Ages, unusual was a very low bar. Something as simple as a strange-looking spoon, a shiny rock, or a book you couldn't read could land you in front of the local magistrate, explaining why you weren't in league with the devil. The rule of thumb was simple. If people didn't recognize it, it was dangerous. And since most villagers' experience with technology stopped at the plough, that covered quite a lot. A compass? Witchcraft? A magnifying glass? Sorcery? A seashell? Even if you lived hundreds of miles from the coast? Obviously a cursed object from a mermaid you'd bribed with your soul. Jewelry was especially risky. If you wore a ring with an unfamiliar design, people assumed it was a talisman that let you summon storms or read minds. And heaven help you if it was engraved in a language no one recognized, even if it was just bad Latin from the local blacksmith who thought he was clever. Books were even worse. Since literacy rates were abysmal, the average person saw writing as a suspicious art form, like drawing symbols for demons to interpret. An herbal guide could be mistaken for a spell book, and a family recipe written down might be seen as a dangerous grimoire for summoning delicious yet evil pies. Sometimes the unusual object was just something foreign. Trade goods from other regions could be exotic and beautiful, but they also screamed, "I've been somewhere strange and picked up otherworldly knowledge." A carved figurine from a distant market might be seen as a protective charm. Not for you, but for the demonic forces you were allegedly working with. Of course, there was also the problem of forgetting you even owned the thing. Many witch trials included an accused person being shocked when an inquisitor pulled something from their home and declared it evidence. An odd-shaped rock, a dried plant, or a bottle of oil. You might think, that's just something my aunt left me. But to the court, it was practically Exhibit A in the case of you versus the eternal flames of damnation. In the Middle Ages, timing wasn't just important for comedy. It was the difference between being a harmless villager and being the devil's jester. Laugh at the wrong moment, and you might as well start gathering kindling for your own execution. If you laughed during a church service, that was practically a signed confession. The devil, they said, was whispering jokes in your ear to distract the faithful. Never mind that the priest had just mispronounced something in Latin so badly it sounded like he was blessing a goat. Your smirk was now solid evidence of demonic possession. Funerals were another minefield. People expected solemn grief, but if you happened to smile or chuckle, maybe because a pallbearer tripped, or because you remembered something funny the deceased once said. The village gossip chain instantly shifted into overdrive. "She's not sad," they'd say. "She's pleased, because she caused it." Even harmless moments could turn dangerous. Imagine the miller is telling a boring story about his grain shipments, and you zone out, thinking about something else entirely. You suddenly laugh at your private thought, and now everyone assumes you're sharing an inside joke with your invisible demonic familiar. Sometimes the suspicion wasn't even about what you laughed at, but when you didn't laugh. If the lord of the manor told a joke and you didn't force out a chuckle, people wondered if you were silently cursing him. So either you laughed too much, too little, or in the wrong tone, all of which could apparently be classified as witchcraft. And heaven forbid your laugh itself sounded strange. A loud cackle, a snort, or an unusually high-pitched giggle was an open invitation for accusations. Villagers believed witches had unnatural laughter. Never mind that the local ale could make anyone sound like a lunatic after a few mugs. The irony? In a time when life was short, brutal, and full of plague, laughter should have been considered a rare blessing. Instead, it was treated like contraband, something you had to ration out carefully, lest it be used as evidence in your trial. In the Middle Ages, living alone wasn't seen as peaceful solitude. It was suspicious isolation. If you weren't part of a household, you clearly had something to hide. And according to popular opinion, that something was probably a cauldron and a pact with Satan. For starters, people didn't really choose to live alone back then. Extended families crammed into cottages, apprentices bunked with masters, and widows usually moved in with relatives. Privacy was basically a luxury no one asked for, except, apparently, witches. So, if you were the one person who preferred your own company, you weren't just independent. You were planning dark rituals without witnesses. Your living situation became even more suspicious if your home was on the edge of the village or in the woods. That wasn't a quiet spot with a nice view. That was a secret lair where you consort with forest spirits and possibly eat children. Never mind that the main reason you lived there was probably because rent was cheaper and the neighbours didn't steal your firewood. And let's be honest, isolation had some practical appeal. You didn't have to deal with gossip, unwanted guests, or someone borrowing your only good cooking pot. But in medieval logic, wanting to avoid other people wasn't a sign of introversion. It was a sign you were plotting the downfall of Christendom, one cursed loaf of bread at a time. Even your daily habits would be scrutinized. Did smoke rise from your chimney at odd hours? Brewing potions? Did you keep your windows shuttered? Hiding demonic rites? Did you light a candle late at night? Communicating with spirits? Because no one in the Middle Ages ever needed light for something mundane like mending socks. It didn't help that most people associated hermits with strange religious zealots or mysterious healers, both groups hovering in that grey area between holy and heresy. So living alone placed you dangerously close to both categories, and one angry neighbour could push you straight into burnable offence territory. In the Middle Ages, making a prediction, any prediction, was like walking into a tavern, announcing you had plague, and expecting people to buy you a drink. It just wasn't going to end well. You didn't have to predict something dramatic like the king's assassination, or the end of the world. No, the bar was much lower. Guess that it might rain tomorrow? Witch. Say you think the harvest will be bad this year? Witch. Casually mention that old Thomas should probably fix his roof before winter. Congratulations, you just hexed his house. The problem was that people remembered when you were right, but conveniently forgot the dozen times you were wrong. If you said there'd be a storm and a week later lightning hit the church steeple, it didn't matter that you were just commenting on the weird clouds. Clearly, you had bent the weather to your will. Even completely obvious predictions could get you in trouble. Anyone with eyes could see the sky darkening and smell rain on the wind, but if you mentioned it aloud before it started, you'd be accused of summoning it. And if you happened to be carrying anything remotely suspicious at the time, say a walking stick or a basket of herbs, you might as well skip to the trial phase Some predictions weren't even about the weather. If you guessed someone's cow might be pregnant, you were reading the signs, which was just medieval speak for consulting unholy forces. And if the cow later gave birth to a calf with any odd markings, people would swear you'd cursed it for your own dark amusement. The irony was that certain respected professions had to predict things. Shepherds, farmers, and sailors all made educated guesses about the seasons, the tides, and the winds. But if you weren't in one of those jobs and you displayed even a hint of foresight, you were a threat to the natural and church-approved order. Worst of all, predicting anything good could be just as dangerous as predicting disaster. If you said, "The baby will be a boy," and it was, people would ask how you knew. And in the absence of biology textbooks, the answer was obvious: magic. In the Middle Ages, growing old wasn't automatically respected. It was tolerated at best, suspicious at worst. And if you lived past the age when you could work the fields, bear children, or stir a pot without spilling half of it, you were in dangerous territory. Because in a world where survival was tough, people liked tidy explanations for unusual things, and living too long practically screamed sorcery. You see, most people didn't make it past 40. If you were still shuffling around at 70, the question wasn't, "What's your secret?" It was, "Whose soul did you steal to get here?" Longevity was viewed less as the result of good genetics and more as the byproduct of dark pacts, especially if you looked spry enough to carry your own firewood. The risk only grew if you outlived most of your peers. With fewer people around to remember your youth, you could be cast as anything in the village's collective memory. The mysterious midwife, the bitter neighbour, the woman who once muttered something about rain in 1346 and was eerily correct. By the time you hit your 80s, you weren't a person anymore. You were a walking, talking repository of suspicious stories. Even the normal signs of aging worked against you. Wrinkled skin, proof the devil had marked you. Failing eyesight, obviously the result of too many late-night rituals by candlelight. A hunched back. That's what happens when you've carried a cauldron around for decades. And let's not forget the medieval obsession with witches' teeth. If you were missing a few, people might assume you'd used them in potions. And heaven help you if you were still mentally sharp. In a society where most people couldn't read, knowing things, especially at your age, could only mean one thing: you were hoarding forbidden knowledge. You weren't wise, you were dangerous. To make matters worse, older women were particularly vulnerable. Without a husband to protect them, they were seen as socially adrift, and therefore more likely to be spending time with less reputable company, like spirits or demons. The year was 1119, and the Holy Land stood at a fragile crossroads. The First Crusade had ended 2 decades earlier, leaving a scattering of Christian-held territories in a region still brimming with hostility. The streets of Jerusalem might have felt safe within the city walls, but beyond them, the roads leading to sacred sites were perilous. Pilgrims, poor farmers, noble ladies, even repentant knights, were being ambushed by bandits, enslaved by raiders, or simply killed for their meagre possessions. Every journey to the Holy Sepulchre risked becoming a one-way trip. Into this dangerous world stepped a French knight named Hugues de Payan. A man of deep piety but also clear-eyed practicality, Hugues saw that swords could serve Christ as well as prayers. With 8 fellow knights, he swore a solemn oath in the presence of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, to live as monks, to fight as soldiers, and above all, to protect pilgrims making their way to holy places. This was no small commitment. The men renounced personal wealth, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and pledged their lives to a cause that could end at any roadside ambush. Their headquarters was no ordinary lodging. King Baldwin II granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, in a wing of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed by Crusaders to stand on the site of King Solomon's temple. From this sacred location, the knights took their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Knights Templar. Their appearance was stark and symbolic, a plain white mantle for purity, marked with a bold red cross for martyrdom. They were not wandering mercenaries. They were an armed brotherhood, accountable only to the Pope himself. This made them immune from local political squabbles, a fact that would both empower them and, in time, make them dangerous to their enemies. In their early years, the Templars were few in number and modest in resources, relying on donations from nobles in Europe who saw them as the Church's sword arm in the East. But word of their courage began to spread. Pilgrims spoke of white-cloaked knights riding fearlessly into danger, cutting through ambushes like avenging angels. In an age when faith and war were inseparable, the Templars embodied both. Holy men who carried Bibles in their hearts and steel in their hands. It was the beginning of an order that would grow far beyond its humble origins, building a legacy of castles, wealth, and mystery that would haunt history for centuries. Long before swords were drawn in the Holy Land, another group had already planted its roots in Jerusalem, not as warriors, but as caregivers. The Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, later known simply as the Hospitallers, began in the 11th century as a humble brotherhood, tending to sick and weary pilgrims. In a city sacred to three faiths, they offered medicine, food, and shelter without asking questions about a traveller's birthplace or past sins. But after the First Crusade in 1099, the world around them changed. The streets filled not only with pilgrims, but with soldiers, merchants, and spies. The air itself seemed thick with tension. The Hospitallers realized that compassion alone would not shield their patients from raiders or war. Under the leadership of Blessed Gerard, and later his successor Raymond Dupuy, the order transformed from a purely charitable mission into a militarized brotherhood. The black cloak they had worn as healers gained a new emblem, a white, eight-pointed cross, symbolizing the virtues they vowed to uphold: faith, humility, mercy, and justice among them. Their role expanded dramatically. No longer confined to hospital wards, the Hospitallers built and manned formidable castles across the Crusader states. Fortresses like Crackle Chevalier in Syria, whose walls would come to be feared by Muslim armies and admired by fellow Crusaders. Within these walls, their dual identity thrived. In one hall, they cared for the sick and wounded. In another, they trained with sword and shield, preparing for the next call to arms. Unlike the Templars, whose reputation rested heavily on elite battlefield prowess, the Hospitallers cultivated a balance between war and charity. A Hospitaller knight might spend one day defending a fortress tower from a siege and the next changing bandages in a hospital ward. This blend of martial skill and compassion won them widespread respect among both allies and, grudgingly, enemies. Papal recognition in 1113 cemented their independence, placing them under the direct authority of the Pope, free from local rulers' control. This autonomy allowed the Hospitallers to grow wealthy and powerful through donations of land and treasure from across Europe. Every noble who sought spiritual redemption found the Hospitallers a worthy cause to support. By the mid-12th century, the order had become a cornerstone of Crusader defense and logistics. They were not simply soldiers or medics. They were the lifeline of the Crusader states, standing watch over both the living and the dying, in a land where the two were often only a sword's length apart. While the Templars and Hospitallers were already well established in the Holy Land, the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, better known as the Teutonic Knights, was born from a more specific need to serve German-speaking pilgrims and crusaders. The year was 1190, and the Third Crusade was raging. Outside the besieged city of Acre, the conditions were grim. Disease, heat, and wounds claimed more lives than swords. Among the chaos, a group of merchants from Lübeck and Bremen erected a field hospital under a simple tent of ship sails. Its mission was humble but vital: to care for their countrymen in a foreign land where language barriers could mean the difference between life and death. What began as a makeshift infirmary soon grew into a recognized order. In 1198, under the blessing of Pope Innocent III, the Teutonic Knights were formally established as a military monastic order, blending the Hospitallers' healing mission with the Templars' martial discipline. Their habit was striking: a white mantle bearing a bold black cross, a stark contrast to the sunburnt sands of the Levant. Initially, their numbers were small, and their influence limited compared to the older orders. But they had one advantage: strong ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Many of their recruits were seasoned German knights, loyal to their homeland's rulers and eager to carry imperial prestige into the Crusader states. They built hospitals, fortified outposts, and joined major campaigns, often fighting alongside their Templar and Hospitaller counterparts. Yet the Holy Land would not be their final stage. The Teutonic Knights soon turned their gaze north and east, where pagan tribes still resisted Christianization. In the early 13th century, they embarked on the Baltic Crusades, carving out a Crusader state along the shores of the Baltic Sea. There, they built towering castles of stone, imposed Christian rule, and engaged in decades of brutal warfare against the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Samogitians. In both the Holy Land and Europe, the Teutonic Knights combined fierce military campaigns with an organized, almost bureaucratic approach to governance. They were not just warriors, they were colonizers, administrators, and master builders. Their order's rigid discipline, German efficiency, and unyielding faith made them a formidable force, admired by allies, feared by foes. Though their origins lay in a small hospital tent outside Acre, the Teutonic Knights would grow into one of the most powerful and enduring military orders of the medieval world, leaving a legacy of stone fortresses and contested frontiers. Though the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights differed in origins and missions, they were bound together by a common foundation: the monastic rule that shaped their lives. Joining one of these orders meant more than picking up a sword. It was a total surrender of personal freedom to a life of obedience, discipline, and faith. A recruit, often a knight of noble birth, would renounce all personal wealth upon admission. Lands, titles, and income were handed over to the order, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weapons issued to him. In exchange, he received the habit of the order. For Templars, the white mantle with its red cross. For Hospitallers, the black cloak with a white cross. For Teutonic Knights, the white with black. These garments were not simply uniforms, they were symbols of vows taken before God. Life within the order followed a strict rhythm. Days began and ended with prayer, often in the chill of a candlelit chapel. Meals were eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud, a reminder that the knight's body was fed for one reason only: to serve God in battle or charity. Luxuries were forbidden: no hunting for sport, no decorative armor, no brightly colored clothing. Horses were shared between knights, and personal servants were strictly limited. Even letters from home could be inspected by superiors to prevent distraction from the mission. Above all, knights were expected to live by the 3 monastic vows: poverty, owning nothing for themselves; chastity, forgoing marriage and family; and obedience, carrying out orders without hesitation. But to these vows, the military orders added another: the defense of Christendom, even to the point of martyrdom. A knight was to stand his ground against the enemy, never fleeing unless ordered, and to protect pilgrims, widows, and orphans from harm. Breaking these rules could mean harsh penance, fasting, public humiliation, or even expulsion from the order. Yet the discipline forged by this code created some of the most feared and respected warriors of the medieval world. Their enemies might see them as fanatics, but to fellow Christians, they were holy champions, steel-clad monks who served not for gold or glory, but for the salvation of souls. It was this strict code that allowed small groups of knights to hold fortresses against armies many times their size, to march into hopeless battles without fear, and to inspire awe across Europe and the Middle East. The code was their strength, and in some ways, the seed of their eventual downfall. The Crusader orders did not simply patrol roads or guard gates. They reshaped the very landscape of the medieval Near East. Castles were their lifeblood, both symbols of power and anchors of survival in a hostile land. For the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, these fortresses were more than military bases. They were centers of administration, supply depots, and rallying points for Christian defense. One of the most legendary was Crac des Chevaliers, a Hospitaller stronghold in modern-day Syria. Perched high on a hill, it looked almost like a city unto itself. massive concentric walls, deep moats, and towers that could rain death on any approaching army. It could house thousands, store years' worth of supplies, and withstand siege engines for months. Even the great Muslim leader Saladin avoided a direct assault, knowing it would drain his forces. The Templars had their own chain of fortresses, each strategically placed to guard key routes. Safed, Tortosa, and the coastal stronghold of Chateau Pèlerin bristled with high walls and angular defences designed to deflect stones and arrows. Inside, they contained chapels, barracks, storerooms, and cisterns to collect rainwater. Every inch planned for the long grind of siege warfare. The Teutonic Knights, though less prominent in the Levant, would make their architectural mark in the Baltic. Their castles in Prussia and Livonia were not just fortresses, but symbols of colonization, built in stark brick and stone, dominating the surrounding countryside. Structures like Marienburg Castle in modern Poland became administrative capitals, housing not only soldiers, but also officials, scribes, and treasuries. These castles were rarely built for beauty, yet their imposing presence inspired awe and dread alike. Walls could be 10 meters thick, gates reinforced with iron, and towers positioned to allow crossfire on attackers. Inside, the layout reflected the dual life of the orders. Chapels for prayer stood beside armories stacked with weapons, kitchens and refectories supported daily life, while underground storerooms held enough grain and salted meat to last through years of isolation. Maintaining these fortresses was a monumental task. Supplies had to be shipped from Europe, skilled masons and engineers employed, and garrisons kept ready for sudden attacks. But in a world where alliances shifted quickly and borders were drawn in blood, the castles of the Crusader orders were unyielding anchors, visible proof that faith, steel, and stone could hold back the tide of enemies. Though the Crusader orders were born in vows of poverty, their influence soon made them some of the wealthiest institutions in medieval Christendom. From castles in the Holy Land to estates in France, England, and Germany, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights controlled vast networks of land, farms, mills, and ports. These holdings were gifts from kings, nobles, and merchants who believed that donating to the orders would secure divine favour, and perhaps a few earthly advantages. The Templars, in particular, mastered a skill that would change European finance: banking. Pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land faced a dangerous problem. Carrying large sums of coin made them prime targets for thieves. The Templars solved this with a system of letters of credit. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in Europe, receive a written note, and then withdraw the equivalent in the East. This not only kept the pilgrim safe, but also allowed the Templars to transfer and invest funds on a massive scale. Soon, kings themselves began using Templar treasuries. The order became bankers to monarchs, financing wars, managing royal revenues, and safeguarding national treasures. Their network of fortresses doubled as secure vaults, each garrison a heavily armed branch office. The Hospitallers, though less involved in banking, accumulated their own immense resources through rents, agricultural production, and the spoils of war. Their estates in Europe funded hospitals, castles, and fleets, ensuring their military and charitable work never lacked supplies. The Teutonic Knights, operating in the Baltic, built a self-sustaining economy from conquered lands, levying taxes, monopolizing trade routes, and exploiting resources like amber, a luxury commodity in medieval Europe. Wealth brought undeniable advantages: better armor, stronger castles, and the ability to hire skilled mercenaries when manpower ran short. But it also drew suspicion. In an age when the church preached humility, the sight of warrior monks dining well, wearing fine cloaks, or holding sway over kings could provoke envy and fear. Still, for centuries, their riches underpinned their military and political dominance. These were not isolated bands of sword-wielding zealots. They were global organizations, with logistical networks stretching from London to Acre, from Lubeck to Cyprus. Their coin could buy ships, armies, and influence, making them as much a force in medieval politics as on the battlefield. In the Crusader era, Gold and faith marched hand in hand, and the military orders knew better than anyone how to wield both. The military orders were forged in the crucible of war, and their reputations were sealed on blood-soaked battlefields. From the Levant to the Baltic, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights fought in some of the most desperate campaigns of the medieval world, often as the shock troops who could turn the tide, or as the last to stand when all hope was gone. One of the Templars' most famous moments came at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, stricken with leprosy, led a vastly outnumbered force against Saladin's army. The Templars charged with ruthless precision, shattering the Muslim vanguard and throwing Saladin's ranks into chaos. The victory was a stunning display of discipline over numbers, cementing the Templars' legend as fearless warriors. The Hospitallers earned their own immortal glory during the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, centuries after the loss of the Holy Land. Facing a massive Ottoman fleet and tens of thousands of soldiers, the Hospitallers held out for weeks, their walls battered but unbroken. Every breach was met with sword and shield, and their blend of medical care and martial ferocity kept the defenders fighting even as casualties mounted. The Teutonic Knights, meanwhile, shifted the theatre of war northward. Their defining moment came at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, when they faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian force. The clash was one of the largest in medieval Europe, and for the Teutonic Order, it ended in disaster. Their Grand Master fell, thousands of knights lay dead, and their power in the Baltic began to wane. Yet even in defeat, their disciplined formations and heavy cavalry charges were remembered as models of medieval warfare. The orders also played crucial roles in less famous but equally vital campaigns, defending supply lines in the Holy Land, escorting pilgrims through enemy territory, and launching raids deep into hostile lands to disrupt enemy logistics. Their mobility, training, and iron discipline allowed them to fight both in open field battles and in grueling sieges, adapting to terrain and circumstance. In victory, they were hailed as God's champions. In defeat, they were martyred in the eyes of their supporters. Their banners, whether bearing the red cross, the white eight-pointed cross, or the black cross, became rallying points on battlefields from Jerusalem to Prussia. These campaigns, both glorious and tragic, carved the orders into the stone of history, not just as monks or warriors, but as symbols of an era when faith and war marched as one. The Crusader orders had been born in the age of the Great Crusades, but as the centuries passed, the world that had created them began to change. By the late 13th century, the Christian strongholds in the Holy Land were falling one by one. The Templars fought fiercely at Acre in 1291, but when the city fell, the last major Crusader outpost in the east was gone. The orders retreated to Cyprus, Rhodes, and eventually Malta. But the dream of a Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was over. Without their original mission, the orders faced an identity crisis. They still possessed immense wealth, vast lands in Europe, and powerful armies, but no longer fought for the same unifying cause that had made them indispensable. And in an age when kings grew wary of rivals, that made them dangerous. The Templars faced the harshest fate. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, moved against them with ruthless efficiency. On a single day, Templars across France were arrested, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites. Under torture, many confessed to impossible crimes. Pope Clement V, under Philip's pressure, dissolved the order in 1312. Its lands were seized, its leaders burned at the stake, and the once proud Red Cross vanished from the battlefields of Europe. The Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights survived longer, but not without decline. The Hospitallers relocated to Rhodes, becoming a naval power against the Ottomans, yet they never regained the scale of influence they once held. The Teutonic Knights suffered a crushing blow at Grunwald in 1410, and their Baltic Empire slowly crumbled under the pressure of rising nation-states and the Protestant Reformation. By the 16th century, the great age of the crusading orders was over. Gunpowder had transformed warfare, making the towering stone castles that once symbolized their dominance increasingly obsolete. Monarchs now commanded standing armies, reducing the need for independent knightly orders. Yet their decline was not merely military, it was political. In an era when centralized power was everything, independent institutions with their own armies, fortresses, and treasuries could not survive without the favor of kings. For some, like the Templars, that favor vanished overnight. For others, it faded slowly, replaced by suspicion, envy, and the shifting priorities of a Europe entering the Renaissance. The legacy of the orders would live on, but their golden age, when a knight could be both monk and warrior, banker and builder, was gone forever. The fall of the great Crusader orders did not end their story, it transformed it. Stripped of their political power and military might, they entered a new battlefield: memory, myth, and legend. Over the centuries, the names of the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights would echo not just in history books, but in whispered rumors, romantic tales, and conspiracy theories. The Templars became the most enduring in popular imagination. Their sudden destruction in 1312, their wealth disappearing into shadow, and the haunting execution of Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who, according to legend, cursed King Philip and the Pope as he burned, created fertile ground for speculation. Stories emerged of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and ties to the Holy Grail. From medieval romances to modern novels, the Templars have been recast as guardians of sacred relics, keepers of forbidden truths, or victims of a colossal injustice. The Hospitallers took a different path. Though they no longer ruled vast Crusader states, they endured by adapting. As the sovereign military order of Malta, they continued their tradition of charity and medical care, their 8-pointed cross still recognized around the world. Even stripped of castles and armies, their legacy of service outlasted the empires that once sought their destruction. The Teutonic Knights too persisted. Though their Baltic Empire dissolved, the order survived as a religious and charitable institution. In modern times, they shifted from battlefield to philanthropy, their black cross still a reminder of their disciplined, if sometimes brutal, medieval origins. Legends surrounding these orders often blur the line between fact and fiction. Chroniclers exaggerated their deeds, enemies slandered them, and poets wove them into tales of romance and betrayal. The Templars' alleged connections to Freemasonry, the Hospitallers' secret diplomatic missions, and the Teutonic Knights' supposed lost relics all fed a centuries-long fascination. Their architectural legacy remains visible in stone fortresses scattered across Europe and the Middle East, Crac de Chevalier, Marienburg, and Chateau Pellerin standing as monuments to a time when faith was defended with steel. Today, the crusading orders occupy a unique place in cultural memory. They are part history, part myth, symbols of both the piety and brutality of the medieval world. Whether seen as holy warriors, ruthless conquerors, or mysterious guardians of ancient secrets, they continue to capture imaginations, proof that, though their banners no longer fly in battle, the Crusader orders have never truly left the stage of history. The story of coffee in the Ottoman Empire begins not in Istanbul, but far to the south, in the rugged mountains of Yemen. By the early 16th century, Yemeni Sufi mystics had already been brewing the roasted beans as a way to stay awake during long nights of prayer. From the port of Mocha, this strange dark drink began its journey northward, carried in the holds of merchant ships along the Red Sea trade routes. When coffee first reached the imperial capital, it was unlike anything the Ottomans had tasted before. Tea was not yet common, and wine was forbidden by Islamic law, so this bitter, aromatic brew occupied a unique space. It was neither intoxicating nor bland. It awakened the mind while keeping the body alert, making it a natural companion for conversation, reflection, and work. The earliest cups in Istanbul were served in the private chambers of the elite. Palace kitchens experimented with the drink, perfecting its preparation in small copper pots known as kezve, and serving it in delicate porcelain cups without handles. The Ottomans quickly elevated coffee to an art form. Finely ground beans were simmered slowly over low heat, often sweetened and sometimes spiced with cardamom. The brewing process became almost ceremonial, a performance in miniature. Coffee's arrival coincided with a period of intense cultural flourishing in the Ottoman capital. Istanbul in the mid-1500s was a melting pot of languages, faiths, and trades, its markets teeming with goods from 3 continents. Coffee fit perfectly into this cosmopolitan atmosphere. Merchants from Syria, Yemen, and Egypt found eager customers among Istanbul's residents, who were always keen to sample the latest luxury from abroad. At first, coffee remained a drink for the wealthy and well-connected. Bags of beans were expensive, and brewing required specialized utensils. But its popularity grew rapidly, and soon the demand outstripped the palace walls. Traders began importing coffee in bulk, and enterprising vendors prepared it for common citizens. What had once been a rare indulgence of the court started appearing in workshops, markets, and street corners. By the time the first public coffee houses opened in Istanbul in the 1550s, the drink had already transformed from an exotic curiosity into a social necessity. In just a few decades, coffee had not only entered Ottoman life, it had begun to reshape it. From humble Yemeni origins, it was on its way to becoming the beating heart of urban culture in one of the world's greatest empires. By the mid-16th century, coffee had spilled beyond the confines of elite households and palace kitchens, and Istanbul was ready for a new kind of social space. The city's bustling streets, lined with spice markets, bathhouses, and mosques, now gained an entirely new fixture: the public coffee house. The earliest recorded establishments appeared around 1554, founded by 2 enterprising men from Aleppo and Damascus. They recognized that coffee was more than a drink. It was a reason for people to gather. In these modest shops, small copper pots simmered over glowing charcoal, filling the air with a rich, earthy aroma. Wooden benches lined the walls, and customers sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping from porcelain cups as they engaged in conversation, watched storytellers, or played backgammon. These coffee houses were revolutionary for Ottoman urban life. Until their arrival, most public gathering spaces were tied to religion, trade, or leisure activities like the bathhouse. The coffee house created a neutral ground, open to merchants, artisans, scholars, soldiers, and travelers alike, where social boundaries could blur. A janissary might find himself sharing a table with a poet, or a merchant might overhear a debate between 2 theologians. The atmosphere was lively, often accompanied by the clack of game pieces, the rhythmic recitation of poetry, or the laughter of friends exchanging gossip. A single cup of coffee might last an hour, giving patrons ample time to talk, listen, and observe. Unlike taverns, which served alcohol, coffee houses encouraged clear-headed discussion, making them safe havens for both spirited debate and quiet reflection. Coffee house owners quickly learned that the environment mattered as much as the drink. Many decorated their spaces with carpets, lamps, and calligraphy. Some hired musicians or storytellers to keep patrons entertained. Others became known for their particular brewing style or for adding unique spices to the coffee. It didn't take long for these establishments to spread across the empire. From the capital to provincial towns, coffee houses became landmarks in the urban landscape. They served as morning meeting spots for tradesmen, afternoon retreats for scholars, and nighttime stages for performers. But their openness also attracted attention from the authorities. Here, conversations could wander from harmless poetry to sharp political critique. Within just a few years of their rise, coffee houses would become both cherished centres of community and suspect arenas in the eyes of the state, a dual reputation that would follow them for centuries. From their earliest days, Ottoman coffee houses became more than places to drink coffee. They were stages for culture. In a city where literacy was prized but not universal, these spaces brought the arts to life through performance. The moment you stepped inside a well-known coffee house in Istanbul's Tahtakale or Üsküdar districts, you might be greeted not by a merchant calling for orders, but by the rhythmic, almost hypnotic voice of a storyteller. Storytellers, known as medders, were masters of the spoken word. With a cane in hand and a scarf over their shoulder, they shifted effortlessly between characters, mimicking voices and weaving tales drawn from Ottoman history, folklore, and the wider Islamic world. They could make sultans seem as human as a neighbour and turn everyday mishaps into comedies that had the entire room laughing. Coffee houses gave these performers a platform, and in return, the meadows gave coffee houses their soul. Poetry, too, thrived in these smoky rooms. Patrons recited verses by the great Ottoman poets like Baki and Fuzuli, or improvised their own in a spirit of friendly competition. Poetic duels, where two wordsmiths exchanged witty couplets on the spot, were as exciting as any backgammon match. The slow sipping of coffee seemed to encourage both the patience to listen and the creativity to speak. Music was another frequent guest. Some coffee houses became known for the soft strains of the oud or ney, their melodies blending with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of cups. In certain venues, shadow puppetry performances, karagos and hasivat, would draw crowds in the evenings, their playful banter and social satire making both children and adults laugh. These artistic gatherings blurred the lines between entertainment and education. Stories carried moral lessons, poems conveyed philosophical reflections, and songs preserved oral traditions. For many, the coffee house was not just a social venue, but an informal school, one where you could learn history, language, and wit without ever opening a book. As word of these vibrant gatherings spread, artists and intellectuals began to seek out coffee houses as places to test new ideas, refine their work, or simply find an audience. In this way, the Ottoman coffee house became a cultural hub, part theatre, part classroom, part salon, where creativity could thrive in the warm glow of oil lamps and the steady scent of freshly brewed coffee. While poetry and storytelling gave Ottoman coffee houses their cultural prestige, games gave them their everyday heartbeat. Step into one on a late afternoon, and you'd hear more than just the hum of conversation. You'd hear the sharp clack of backgammon pieces, the shuffle of playing cards, and bursts of laughter as friends teased each other over a well-played move. Backgammon, or tavla, reigned supreme. Its origins stretched back centuries, and in the Ottoman coffee house it became more than just a pastime. It was a display of wit and strategy. Old men hunched over boards like generals over battle maps, while younger players hovered nearby, learning tricks and debating the odds. The rhythmic roll of dice was as much a part of the coffee house soundscape as the simmering sezvi. Chess also held a place of honour. Patrons who fancied themselves intellectuals would engage in slow, deliberate matches, drawing on tactics as old as Persia itself. A single game could stretch for hours, accompanied by sips of coffee and murmured analysis from onlookers. For many, these games were not just entertainment. They were a way to test one's mind, patience, and composure. Card games, often imported from Europe, added variety to the leisure mix, though they occasionally sparked moral debates. Some religious scholars frowned upon their association with gambling, yet in many coffee houses, they were played in a friendly spirit, with wagers limited to pride and bragging rights. Leisure in the coffee house extended beyond the games themselves. It was in the pauses between moves, in the long, companionable silences, and in the quiet observation of passers-by through open doors. Here, men escaped the pressures of work and family for an hour or two, finding comfort in routine. Regulars had their favourite spots, and friendships deepened over countless shared cups. The coffee house was also a place where news was traded as quickly as gossip. Merchants shared rumours about market prices, travellers brought tales from distant provinces, and political developments often arrived here before they were formally announced. A game board might pause mid-match while a patron recounted a new decree from the palace or a scandal from the court. In the Ottoman coffee house, leisure was never idle. Every game, every chat, and every sip of coffee wove together into a rich tapestry of daily life, a blend of competition, camaraderie, and the unhurried pleasures that made these establishments indispensable to the rhythm of the city. As Ottoman coffee houses flourished, they became more than cultural salons and gaming parlours. They evolved into political nerve centres. The same qualities that made them ideal for poetry and leisurely debate also made them perfect for the exchange of political ideas. In an empire that stretched across 3 continents, Information travelled in fragments, rumours, and whispers, and the coffee house was where those fragments came together. Inside, merchants from the bazaar discussed changes in tax policy. Janissaries shared grievances about their pay, and clerks speculated on shifts in the Sultan's court. A single conversation might jump from the price of grain to the latest military campaign, weaving together local concerns with imperial affairs. The coffee house gave ordinary citizens, who had no place in the halls of power, a forum to voice opinions and measure the mood of the city. This openness, however, did not escape the attention of the authorities. Sultans and their viziers quickly recognized that coffee houses could act as incubators for dissent. Political satire, woven subtly into a storyteller's tale or a shadow puppet play, could carry sharper criticism than any public speech. News, real or exaggerated, spread rapidly from one coffee house to another, often faster than the state could control. Some rulers tried to curb the influence of these establishments. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV famously banned coffee entirely, sending soldiers to patrol the streets for violators. The official reasoning was moral. Coffee was accused of fostering idleness and moral decay, but the underlying concern was its role in gathering politically minded crowds. Still, even under such bans, coffee houses often operated in secret, their doors closing quickly at the sight of patrols, the aroma of brewing coffee hidden behind the smell of cooking. Despite intermittent crackdowns, the political life of the coffee house persisted. In many ways, it was the Ottoman equivalent of a public square combined with a newsroom. Ideas could be tested here, grievances aired, and alliances forged over shared cups. By the 18th century, the authorities realized that coffee houses were too deeply ingrained in urban life to eliminate. Instead, some rulers placed informants among the patrons, listening to the flow of conversation and reporting back to the palace. In this way, the coffee house remained both a symbol of free exchange and a reminder that in the Ottoman Empire, even the most casual conversation could carry weight in the corridors of power. One of the most remarkable features of the Ottoman coffee house was its ability to bring together people who, outside its doors, might never share the same space. In a society layered with social, economic, and professional divisions, the coffee house blurred boundaries in ways few other institutions could. A typical Istanbul coffee house in the 17th or 18th century might host an astonishing mix. A bearded imam pausing between lessons at the mosque, a wealthy silk merchant from the bazaar, a weathered sailor fresh from the docks, a janissary in full uniform, and a poet seeking inspiration. Here, they sat side by side on wooden benches, sipping from the same kind of cup, listening to the same storyteller, laughing at the same witty remark. This social mixing was partly due to coffee itself. Unlike wine, it carried no religious prohibition, and unlike lavish feasts, it was affordable to most city dwellers. A single serving cost little, making it accessible to apprentices, artisans, and labourers. At the same time, the refined preparation and elegant presentation appealed to scholars, officials, and members of the elite. Occupations often shaped coffeehouse clientele. Certain venues became unofficial headquarters for specific trades. Porters gathered in one, scribes in another, sailors in a third. Yet even in these specialized settings, visitors from outside the trade were welcome, drawn in by the warmth of the stove in winter or the cool shade in summer. Religious and ethnic diversity also played a role. In cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Salonika, Muslims, Christians, and Jews sometimes shared the same coffee house, especially in neighborhoods where trade and travel brought communities into close contact. Though tensions could flare, the shared rituals of ordering, serving, and drinking coffee often smoothed over differences, at least for the length of a cup. This mingling of classes and communities was both the charm and the danger of the coffee house. For ordinary people, it offered a rare chance to hear perspectives far beyond their own circle. News from distant provinces, gossip from the palace, or philosophical musings from a learned stranger. For the authorities, however, the idea of janissaries chatting freely with merchants or artisans debating with scholars hinted at a dangerous levelling of social hierarchies. Still, it was precisely this blend of voices that gave the Ottoman coffee house its unique energy. Within its walls, status mattered less than wit, eloquence, and the ability to hold your own in conversation. A small but significant taste of equality in a hierarchical world. In the Ottoman Empire, the coffee house was a male-dominated space, a public stage where politics, games, and debates unfolded among men of all ranks. Women, by custom and social expectation, did not frequent these establishments. This absence has often led to the impression that coffee culture was an exclusively male domain, but the reality was more complex. Women were deeply involved in the culture of coffee, just in different settings. In the private sphere of the home, coffee played a central role in hospitality, courtship, and social visits. A young woman's skill at brewing coffee could even influence marriage prospects, and elaborate serving sets became prized possessions in a dowry. Female guests were served coffee in gilded cups, often alongside sweetmeats, and these intimate gatherings mirrored the conversational and leisurely spirit of the public coffee house, just without the public exposure. Some wealthier women participated in coffee culture through the imperial court. In the Topkapi Palace, elite women of the harem enjoyed coffee as a daily luxury, served by specialized coffee attendants. The harem's women, particularly the valide sultan and favored consorts, could influence politics indirectly, and coffee became one of many luxuries around which courtly intrigues and discussions took place. While it was rare for women to step into public coffee houses, there were exceptions. In cosmopolitan port cities or frontier towns, foreign women, particularly from Europe, sometimes visited out of curiosity, recorded in travelers' accounts as spectacles that surprised local patrons. In certain provincial towns, mixed-gender coffee houses existed on the margins of Ottoman norms, though they were often tied to inns, markets, or entertainment venues. The question of women's presence in coffee houses occasionally entered public debate. Conservative critics feared that any mingling of men and women in such spaces could erode moral boundaries. Yet these same critics often ignored the vibrant female coffee culture that thrived behind closed doors, where women engaged in the same games, storytelling, and gossip that enlivened the male spaces. In the 19th century, as Ottoman society modernized, new public venues such as European-style cafes and patisseries began to blur these gender divisions. Women of the upper and middle classes, particularly in cosmopolitan centers like Istanbul and Izmir, began to appear in select public coffee houses, still a minority, but a sign that the boundaries were shifting. Thus, while the Ottoman coffee house in its classic form remained a male preserve, women were never absent from coffee culture itself. They simply nurtured their own parallel tradition, one equally rich in conversation, hospitality, and the ritual pleasure of the brew. For all their popularity, Ottoman coffee houses lived under a shadow of suspicion. To the sultans and their advisors, these bustling hubs of conversation were double-edged swords, places of social bonding, yes, but also fertile ground for gossip, satire, and potentially dangerous political talk. The first major crackdown came in the early 17th century under Sultan Murad IV, a ruler famed for his strictness and his personal austerity. Murad believed coffee houses encouraged idleness, undermined public morals, and, most dangerously, served as meeting grounds for dissenters. In 1633, after a devastating fire in Istanbul, blamed, perhaps unfairly, on careless coffeehouse patrons, Murad ordered the closure of all such establishments. Coffee itself was banned, and violators faced harsh punishments, sometimes even execution. Yet the closures never truly killed coffeehouse culture. Many establishments went underground, operating discreetly behind shuttered doors or disguised as private homes. Patrons learned to hide their cups and sezves at the first sign of patrols. The bans became a cat-and-mouse game between authorities and citizens, with enforcement varying depending on the ruler's temperament. Later sultans, while less severe than Murad, still treated coffee houses warily. The concern was not just moral decay, but political risk. The Janissary Corps, whose loyalty was vital but unpredictable, often gathered in coffee houses. These meetings could be harmless camaraderie, or the seedbed for mutinies. In times of unrest, shutting down coffee houses became an easy way for the government to disrupt potential conspiracies. Even in peaceful times, coffee houses drew suspicion, because they were hard to control. Unlike the mosque, they were not under direct religious supervision. Unlike the marketplace, they were not tied to official trade guilds. They were semi-autonomous spaces, run by private owners and filled with free-flowing talk, a combination that made bureaucrats uneasy. Some rulers tried regulation, rather than outright bans. Licenses were introduced, taxes imposed, and in some cases, state informants were placed among the patrons. Storytellers and performers were warned against crossing certain political lines, though many found clever ways to veil criticism in allegory or humour. In the end, coffeehouses proved remarkably resilient. Each ban only seemed to deepen public affection for them, turning the act of sharing a cup of coffee into a quiet gesture of defiance. This tug-of-war between the people's love of coffee and the state's mistrust of its gathering places became one of the most enduring themes in the Ottoman coffeehouse story. By the twilight of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the coffeehouse had already outlived bans, moral crusades, and political suspicion. What began as a Yemeni import in the 1500s had grown into an institution so deeply woven into urban life that it was impossible to imagine the empire without it. Even as railways, telegraphs, and European-style cafes transformed city life, the traditional Ottoman coffeehouse retained its magnetic pull. Its influence stretched far beyond the walls of its smoky interiors. The coffeehouse had shaped the way Ottomans socialized, debated, and even thought. It had nurtured storytellers, poets, musicians, and amateur philosophers. It had been both a cradle of high art and a stage for everyday humor, where a porter's sharp joke could earn as much applause as a scholar's polished verse. It was a school for listening as much as speaking, a place where news was sifted, opinions tested, and worldviews expanded. The political dimension never disappeared. Even in the empire's final decades, coffeehouses served as unofficial newsrooms, where discussions about constitutional reform, modernization, and the empire's place in a rapidly changing world could flow more freely than in official venues. Many of the ideas that would shape the early Turkish Republic and modern Middle Eastern politics were first debated over small porcelain cups in such spaces. Culturally, the Ottoman coffeehouse left an enduring mark on architecture, literature, and daily ritual. The image of men gathered under low-hanging lamps, smoke curling upward, dice clattering on wooden boards, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air became a defining scene of Ottoman urban identity. Even today, in cities like Istanbul, Sarajevo, and Cairo, echoes of this tradition live on in neighborhood kahvehaneler, where the pace is unhurried and conversation flows as steadily as the drink itself. Globally, the Ottoman coffeehouse contributed to the spread of coffee culture far beyond its borders. European travelers carried the idea home, and by the 17th century, coffeehouses in London, Paris, and Vienna were thriving, direct heirs to their Ottoman counterparts in both form and function. The legacy of the Ottoman coffeehouse is not just the drink, but the ideal it embodied, a space where people of different walks of life could gather, exchange ideas, and feel part of something larger than themselves. In a world that changes faster with each generation, that simple promise, a seat at the table, a cup in hand, and a voice in the conversation, remains as powerful as ever. For the samurai, armor, known as yoroi, was far more than a shield against arrows and blades. It was a second skin, a portable biography, and a public declaration of loyalty. Every curve of lacquered plate, every knot of silk cord, every crest painted in gold, carried meaning that went beyond the battlefield. In a society built upon rigid hierarchies and deep respect for heritage, armor acted as a visible signature of a warrior's lineage. The family crest, or mon, was often emblazoned on the helmet, kabuto, shoulder guards, sewed, and sometimes even on the breastplate, do. To see a warrior's mon was to know his clan, his ancestors, and the legacy he carried into battle. This was not mere decoration. It was an unspoken vow to uphold the honor of those who had worn the same emblem before him. Color was another silent language. Certain hues were reserved for high-ranking families or carried symbolic associations. Crimson could signal courage and a willingness to shed blood for one's lord. Black lacquer conveyed dignity and gravitas. Gold leaf suggested both wealth and divine protection. These choices were deliberate. Every tint and tone was meant to project a specific image to friend and foe alike. Patterns and ornamentation often drew on spiritual symbolism. A helmet might be crowned with a crest shaped like a dragon to invoke ferocity, or adorned with antlers to channel the power and endurance of the stag. Some samurai incorporated motifs from Shinto and Buddhist beliefs: lotus flowers for purity, waves for resilience, or the rising sun for imperial loyalty. These emblems served as talismans, a constant reminder of the warrior's virtues and the spiritual forces he called upon in combat. Even the lacquered finish itself was more than practical. The glossy surface repelled water and protected the underlying metal or leather, but it also created an almost mirror-like sheen, allowing the armor to gleam in sunlight. A subtle form of intimidation on the battlefield. When an enemy faced a line of samurai, each gleaming suit was a declaration: we are ready, we are united, and we carry the weight of history on our shoulders. To wear yoroi was to embody one's clan, faith, and personal honor. In the mind of the samurai, the armor was not simply clothing for war, it was an extension of the soul. Removing it after battle was not just a matter of loosening cords, it was a return from a heightened state of being, where every plate and knot had transformed a man into the living image of his lineage. For the samurai, putting on armor was never done in haste. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial act, one that could take an hour or more when done properly. This was not merely about strapping on protection, it was about mentally and spiritually crossing the threshold from daily life into the disciplined state of readiness for combat. The process often began with purification. Some warriors would wash their hands and face with clean water, or even perform brief Shinto rites to honor the kami, spirits, and seek their blessing. Others might recite a short Buddhist sutra for protection or focus silently on their breathing to steady the mind. Going into battle was not just a physical trial, it was a moral and spiritual one, and the act of donning armor was the gateway. Undergarments came first. A light cotton or silk kimono was worn next to the skin, providing comfort and a base layer to prevent chafing. Over this, a padded jacket, shitagi, and hidate, thigh guards, would be fitted. These pieces ensured that the heavier plates could be worn for hours without exhausting the body. Each layer was tied with precision, the cords adjusted so they would not loosen in the chaos of battle. Next came the armored components in a carefully ordered sequence. The sunite, shin guards, were strapped on first, followed by the coat, armored sleeves. Then the do, or cuirass, was placed around the torso and tied securely at the sides. This central piece was often the most ornate, bearing the clan crest prominently. The sword, shoulder guards, followed, wide and flaring to protect against downward strikes. The helmet, kabuto, was often left for last, as it signaled the final moment before readiness. Secured under the chin with a shinobi no-o cord, the kabuto's weight and enclosed feeling reminded the warrior that from this point forward, he was no longer an individual. He was a samurai in battle form. Assistants, usually retainers or fellow warriors, often helped in the process. This was not simply for efficiency, but as a mark of trust and solidarity. The act of tying another man's armor was intimate and significant. It meant you were preparing him for life or death struggle. By the time the final knot was tightened and the last plate polished with a sleeve, the samurai was transformed. The ritual of preparation had honed his focus, anchored his resolve, and reminded him that he carried not just his own fate, but the honor of his clan into whatever lay ahead. Among all the pieces of samurai armor, none carried more symbolic and psychological weight than the kabuto, the helmet. It was the final piece placed upon the warrior's head before stepping into battle, and with it came a transformation, not just in appearance, but in spirit. If the yoroi was the body of the samurai's honor, the kabuto was its crown. The design of a kabuto was as much art as it was engineering. Its bowl, or hachi, was often made from dozens of overlapping metal plates riveted together, creating a structure strong enough to deflect arrows and sword strikes. The front featured a visor, mabizashi, sometimes curved outward to shield the eyes and add a fearsome silhouette. At the back, layered neck guards called shikoro fanned out, protecting the nape without restricting movement. But the kabuto's function extended far beyond protection. It was a visual declaration. Many bore elaborate maedate, crest-like ornaments mounted on the front, which could take the form of gilded horns, fearsome demons, dragons, or stylized clan emblems. These designs were not random decoration. They were carefully chosen symbols meant to inspire allies, intimidate enemies, and proclaim the wearer's identity across the battlefield. A warrior advancing under a pair of towering antlers or a golden sunburst was instantly recognizable, even in the chaos of combat. Inside the kabuto, the ukabari, a silk or cotton lining, helped absorb sweat and provided comfort. The helmet was secured by the shinobi no-o, a cord tied firmly beneath the chin. This knot was critical. If too loose, the helmet could slip at a decisive moment, but if too tight, it could choke the wearer during exertion. Adjusting it was a small but deliberate act, signaling that the samurai was now fully enclosed in his warlike form. There was also etiquette in how the kabuto was handled. It was never placed carelessly on the ground or tossed aside. When not worn, it might rest on a lacquered stand, sometimes displayed in a position of honor in the warrior's home. In ceremonies, it was polished until it gleamed, reflecting the care and pride of its owner. The kabuto was more than just a piece of armor. It was a statement of readiness, a banner for the head, and often a family heirloom passed from one generation to the next. When a samurai lowered it onto his head, it was the final step in a transformation from man to warrior, sealing his role as both protector and representative of his clan's honor. If the kabuto was the crown of the samurai, the do, the cuirass, was its beating heart. This central piece protected the torso, the core of the warrior's body, where a single well-placed arrow or sword thrust could end a life. But the do was more than just protection. It was the canvas upon which a samurai displayed his clan identity, personal taste, and even his philosophy of combat. The do evolved over centuries, beginning as heavy iron or leather plates, and gradually transforming into the lacquered, segmented marvels of the Sengoku period. The armor was often constructed from horizontal lames, kozain, small scales of iron or hardened leather, laced together with silk cords in intricate patterns. These cords, called odoshi, were not just functional. Their colors carried symbolic meaning and could denote rank, clan, or battlefield role. Wearing the do followed its own etiquette. It was fastened around the torso with cords tied in precise knots, ensuring a snug fit without restricting breathing. The front and back panels overlapped to provide extra strength over vital areas. A well-fitted do allowed the samurai to twist, draw his bow, or wield his sword with minimal hindrance, a reminder that mobility was as important as protection. The surface of the do was often a work of art. Some bore the family crest, mon, in gold leaf. Others featured lacquered designs of dragons, waves, or clouds, invoking strength, resilience, and divine favor. These motifs could act as talismans, imbuing the warrior with a sense of invincibility. For those of higher rank, the finish was immaculate, the lacquer polished to a deep shine that caught the light on the battlefield, an intimidating sight for any opponent. Donning the do was a moment of transition. Assistants or retainers might hold it in place as the cords were tightened, checking each knot for security. For a samurai, this step was both practical and symbolic. The chest, home to the heart and lungs, was now shielded by the honor of the clan. In some traditions, a warrior might whisper a brief prayer at this stage, acknowledging the vulnerability of his body and placing his fate in the hands of the gods. Once secured, the do gave the samurai the feeling of being encased in resolve. It was the literal and metaphorical core of his armor, a piece that carried his family's history on its surface and guarded his life beneath its plates. While the do protected the core, a samurai could not fight effectively without safeguarding his limbs. The arms and legs were the moving parts of combat, constantly exposed during swordplay, archery, and mounted charges. For this reason, the sword, kote, and sunita were essential, not just for protection but for balance and agility. The sword, or shoulder guards, were large, rectangular plates that hung from the upper arm, shielding the shoulders and part of the upper torso. Constructed from lacquered iron or leather scales laced together, they flared outward to deflect downward strikes from swords or spears. Their movement was carefully calibrated, loose enough to allow the arm to raise a bow or swing a katana, but secure enough to stay in place during rapid maneuvers. Often they bore the family crest, or were color-coordinated with the do, ensuring the entire suit looked unified. The kote protected the arms from wrist to shoulder. These armored sleeves were made from a combination of chainmail, kusari, metal splints, and fabric padding. The outer arm was heavily reinforced, while the inner arm remained more flexible for ease of motion. Kote were tied at several points to keep them snug, preventing loose fabric from catching on a weapon or an opponent's armor. In close combat, kote could mean the difference between a deflected sword cut and a severed arm. The sunite, or shin guards, shielded the lower legs, a part of the body often targeted in foot combat to destabilize an opponent. Made from vertical iron splints sewn onto cloth or leather backing, sunite were secured with straps behind the calf. The design allowed a warrior to kneel, run, or mount a horse without the plates digging into the skin. Their lacquered surfaces resisted mud and rain, vital in the unpredictable conditions of battlefields. Fitting these limb pieces was a methodical process. The sunite went on first, followed by the kote, and finally the sword. Each step checked for comfort and stability. Assistants often adjusted them to ensure no part of the armor shifted in the heat of combat. Beyond function, these components completed the samurai's silhouette. The flaring sword, articulated kote, and sturdy sunite gave the warrior a balanced, imposing form. They were the moving defenses of the armor, enabling offense and defense to work in harmony, proof that samurai armor was as much about precision engineering as it was about ceremony and honor. In the art of samurai armor, the lower body was never neglected. While the upper torso and head drew the most attention, strikes to the thighs, hips, and groin could be just as lethal. The heidate and kusazuri formed the essential defenses for this vulnerable region, allowing the warrior to move freely while shielding him from slashes, arrows, and glancing spear thrusts. The heidate were thigh guards worn beneath the kusazuri, strapped directly over the kimono or padded undergarments. They consisted of small rectangular iron or leather plates sewn onto a fabric panel, which wrapped around the front of the thighs like an apron. The design ensured flexibility. The plates overlapped slightly to provide coverage without locking the legs into rigid positions. When kneeling or riding, the heidate flexed naturally, preserving agility in the heat of battle. Above them hung the kusazuri, skirt-like strips that extended downward from the bottom edge of the do. Usually made in multiple flaring panels, the kusazuri were constructed from rows of lacquered scales laced together, matching the colour and style of the cuirass. Their primary role was to protect the hips, pelvis, and upper thighs, areas particularly exposed when the samurai leaned forward in combat or while mounted. The kusazuri also served an aesthetic function, completing the visual unity of the armour. They expanded the silhouette of the samurai, making him appear broader and more imposing. The rhythmic sway of the panels as the warrior moved added to his presence, almost like the robes of a ceremonial dancer. Except these panels could deflect a sword blow. Fitting these pieces was part of the armor's careful ritual. The heidate were tied first, snug around the waist and upper legs. Then the kusazuri, already attached to the do, were adjusted to hang evenly. The spacing between the panels was crucial. Too tight, and the panels would hinder leg movement. Too loose, and they might leave dangerous gaps in protection. Symbolically, these lower body defenses represented steadfastness and stability. Just as a building relied on a strong foundation, a samurai relied on his lower body for power in strikes, balance in stances, and endurance in long battles. Protecting it was both a practical necessity and a metaphor for protecting the base of one's strength. Together, The hidate and kusazuri turned vulnerable flesh into a fortified base, enabling the samurai to move with confidence, knowing that every step forward was supported by both engineering and tradition. A samurai's armor might have been built from steel, leather, and lacquer, but it was the cords and belts that held the entire ensemble together. Without them, the suit would be nothing more than a scattered pile of plates. The obi, the broad belt, and the network of himo, armor cords, were the hidden lifelines of yoroi, binding not only its parts but also the warrior's sense of order, discipline, and composure. The obi was the foundation. Worn snugly around the waist, it supported the weight of the swords and sometimes even bore part of the armor's load. Made from thickly woven silk or cotton, the obi was strong, yet flexible, able to be tightened or loosened quickly as needed. When donning armor, it was usually tied first, ensuring a stable base before adding heavier components like the do and kusazuri. The obi also positioned the swords correctly, katana edge up on one side, wakizashi or tanto on the other, so that drawing them was fluid even under the encumbrance of armor. The himo, or armor cords, were more intricate. These silk laces threaded through small holes in the plates, binding components together in a system both functional and decorative. The pattern and colour of the lacing could identify a clan or indicate rank, but the practical role was paramount. These cords kept armour sections articulated and secure during combat. Tying them was an art. Assistants often helped weave and knot the cords, ensuring each section sat precisely where it should. A poorly tied knot could mean disaster in battle, a loose sewed flapping at the wrong moment, a shifting do that exposed the ribs. For this reason, tying armour was done with the same seriousness as sharpening a blade. Knots themselves carried etiquette. Certain ties were meant to be easily undone for quick removal after battle, while others were locked tightly for maximum security. Samurai trained to know the difference, both for their own armour and when assisting comrades. Symbolically, these bindings represented unity between armour pieces, between warrior and clan, and between the physical and spiritual preparation for battle. The fully laced suit was a complete whole, just as the samurai's body, mind, and purpose were aligned once he was ready to fight. In the end, the cords and belt were more than practical fasteners. They were the invisible threads that turned separate parts into a living suit of honor, holding together not just the armor, but the warrior's readiness to step onto the battlefield. For a samurai, armor was not merely equipment. It was an heirloom, a companion, and often a sacred object. To neglect it was to dishonor oneself and one's ancestors. Just as a blade required constant sharpening, armor demanded regular care to keep it battle-ready and worthy of the warrior who wore it. After combat or training, the armor was carefully dismantled piece by piece. Each component, kabuto, do, sode, kote, hidate, sunita, was inspected for damage. Dents in metal plates were hammered out by skilled armorers, while frayed cords were replaced with new silk lacing, often dyed to match the original color. Any chips in the lacquer were touched up, both to preserve the armor's appearance and to protect it from rust. Moisture was the armor's greatest enemy. After a rainy campaign or a humid summer battle, every plate was wiped dry, and the cords aired to prevent mold. Armor was often stored in a dry chest, sometimes lined with rice straw to absorb humidity. The kabuto might be displayed on a lacquered stand, but it was always covered with a cloth to shield it from dust and sunlight. Cleaning was not just practical, it was ceremonial. Some samurai treated the process as a form of meditation, taking the time to reflect on the battle just fought and to prepare mentally for the next. The slow rhythm of untying cords, wiping lacquer, and folding garments became a way of transitioning from the heightened state of combat back to the stillness of everyday life. Respect for armor extended to how it was handled. Dropping a piece carelessly, stepping over it, or placing it in a dirty spot was considered deeply disrespectful. When not in use, armor was stored neatly and in a specific order, ready to be donned quickly if duty called. The armor's longevity was a testament to this care. Well-maintained suits could be passed down for generations. Each layer of lacquer, and every repaired plate telling the story of past battles. Some samurai even inscribed small messages or prayers inside their armor, knowing that one day their descendants might wear it. In this way, maintenance was not just about preserving a tool of war, it was about honoring a living symbol of duty, loyalty, and family heritage. To tend one's armor was to tend one's honor, ensuring that when the time came to wear it again, it would be as ready as the warrior himself. If putting on armor was a ritual of transformation, removing it was a ritual of return. For the samurai, taking off yoroi was never done casually. It marked the end of a period in which he had been more than just a man. He had been the embodiment of his clan's honor, a living weapon, and a guardian of his lord's will. The process began with stillness. After battle or duty, a samurai would stand or kneel as assistants untied the cords, starting from the outermost pieces. The sode and kusazuri were usually removed first, their silk laces loosened with deliberate care to avoid tangling. The clatter of lacquered plates hitting one another was the soundtrack of a warrior shedding his martial shell. The kabuto came next, lifted slowly from the head and placed respectfully on a stand or wrapped in cloth. Removing the helmet was symbolic. It marked the moment when the warrior's mind could lower its guard. For many, the feeling of air on sweat-damp hair was as much an emotional release as a physical one. The do, being the heart of the armor, was often taken off last among the major plates. As it opened and slipped away, the weight lifted from the shoulders was both literal and symbolic. The samurai's body was free again, but so too was his spirit, released from the focused intensity required in armor. Once all the plates were removed, the undergarments were folded neatly and set aside for washing. Assistants or the samurai himself would then inspect each piece for damage, beginning the process of maintenance immediately if needed. Armor was never left scattered. Each component was stored in its proper place, ready for the next call to arms. For some, the removal ritual included a brief prayer of thanks, gratitude for survival, for the armor's protection, and for the honor of fulfilling one's duty. In times of peace, the ritual might be followed by tea or quiet reflection, a way of re-entering daily life with composure. The etiquette of removing armor reminded the samurai that battle was not the only state of existence. Just as a warrior had to know how to fight, he also had to know how to set aside the trappings of war and resume the roles of leader, father, or servant. In this way, the ritual of removal was not an end, but a bridge, connecting the world of combat to the world of living, and ensuring the samurai remained whole in both.